Welcome to another episode of Selling What's Possible, the podcast dedicated to account teams and to revenue leaders. And joining me today is an absolute expert in go-to-market growth strategies, pipeline development, pipeline tracking, what works and what doesn't. Kunal Mehta, who is CEO of TPG Technologies. And Kunal, it is so great to have you join us here.
Sure. Thanks, Dave. And thank you for the invitation. My background in a nutshell, I spent most of my career as an operator, ran RevOps. I was the CMO twice. I was at a company called Infoblox that got acquired by Vista Equity. I came over with part of that team then to TCV, where we continue to build and expand upon those standard operating procedures. I ended up working with 30 different companies during that time and then moved on as a partner to Bain. Continued to work with a number of other companies, both on the diligence side as well as on the commercial side in terms of driving go-to-market excellence. And then came over, I got really hungry to get back into an operating role. I was actually a customer of the Pipeline Group 13 times when I was at TCV. Felt like there was an incredible opportunity to expand, and the tech that TPG had built was in a position to go standalone and contribute huge value. So in addition to the SDR as a service, we will look to kind of break out and build out the technology that can stand alone and other supporting technologies as well.
That's great. I mean, these are the leading private equity companies in the world. I am amazed at some of the things you've told me about the stock market like dashboards that you have to be able to drill in and track, KPIs on the pipeline. So this is going to be a great episode, everybody, because Kunal has so many great insights about what works and what doesn't. And ultimately, our theme today is sort of bridging the pipeline divide that exists between acquisition pipelines, which we all know very well, locked into the CRM and the selling stages, and the expansion pipeline world that is represented by go to customer. And so what I'd like to do, Kunal, just to kick this off, is talk about the current state, the gap between acquisition and expansion pipelines. To me, there's a lot of blind spots that exist where it suboptimizes the allocation of resources, sales resources, time, and focus, because the best opportunities aren't always visible. And there's gaps within the pipelines themselves of acquisition and expansion. So let's just talk about the gap for a minute. What is your experience with the current state of go-to-market pipelines? What you see as typical challenges and areas of improvement?
So I'll share a few stories. One of the things, whether we were at Vista or TCV or Bain, one of the first things we do is help companies prioritize accounts. And of the 60 projects we worked on, I think I only found one that did it well. And what we end up doing is we take the customer data and we take the churn data. Now, that sounds simple, but in 80% of the cases, the customer data requires significant enrichment and deduplication. And that alone, if we did nothing else, adds huge value. Then what we do is we run it through kind of machine learning, and we look at, over 200 variables, and we determine which variables are associated with buying. We built this model, and then we apply that on the new logo universe and determine which companies in the new logo universe kind of are best fit based on the propensity model and where you have the least amount of churn. And when you do that in over 100 cases, what we find a year later is over 80% of close one come from what we call A accounts, which are the best fit accounts. But we also find 20% of accounts that have never been covered before. 100% of the time, territories are out of balance. So again, what this one project does, it moves the needle on the magic number by 8 cents, because now you have extreme focus on best fit accounts. Your territories are balanced. You're going after those accounts. Marketing's going after the same accounts. So it's whether it's a standard operating procedure at Vista, TCV, or Bain, or the Pipeline Group, it's kind of the first place to start, and we've kept iterating on it and made it better each time. I still think that's one of the best places to start to get lift, because you build a customer fact base and a prospect fact base. I think, Dave, in your case, you can almost turn that whole thing inward and say, hey, which companies have the highest propensity to expand and by which product project. And again, that gives you clarity at least you start within your own customer base, are able to determine where to focus your efforts.
Yeah, that's great. It sounds like ABM on steroids, where you're really using an intense amount of data in running models, which I have not typically seen people taking it to that level to scientifically explore who to acquire in the first place. And the results you're getting are great. What is the magic number when you say magic number? Can you
So
describe what that is?
yeah, so the magic number is it's so funny. When I got to TCV, the investor that I was working with was like, "Hey, Kunal, the magic number's off relative to these five comparables. I need you to go fix it." And I actually had to pull him aside and told him, I basically said, I don't understand anything you just told me. And he took the time to actually teach me not only that, but other metrics that he looks at, where he gets his comparables from. And then that was illuminating because then we built our playbooks around the things he was asking us for. So the magic number is year over year growth divided by what I spent in the last 12 months on sales and marketing. And within the portfolio I had, it was 0.38, and the way to decode that is for every dollar I spent on marketing and sales, I'm getting 38 cents in growth. And this investor was saying, hey, the five comparables I looked at, they're getting 75 cents in growth. So your MBO for the year is to fix that. And I suggest you give the CRO and the CMO the same MBO. So you're all singing off the same song sheet, and then deploy your playbook accordingly with their buy-in. So that's kind of how I learned that. And I'm so grateful to the folks at TCV for teaching me all those things.
So that's really that's kind of like that commercial ratio of how much
Yeah,
investment is yielding how much return. And
it's
often,
the same.
oh, we've seen it out of whack, where a lot of spend not yielding, the revenue growth expected on the portfolio.
Yep, yep, and then that drives the playbook. So it's like that propensity modeling thing, and then what sales plays do you run ruthlessly? So you in the propensity model, you might find something like, hey, if Workday is installed, my win rate's 3.5 times higher than my traditional win rate. Well, that's going to say, hey, I should run a marketing campaign um, that targets Workday customers as we work better together with you. Maybe I go to Workday and say, hey, can we build a partnership here that's more of a technology alliance, since our customers are getting this much value when we're both
Right.
installed, and 30% of our customer base has you again. So it drives a lot of strategy as well, but it also builds this, I would say, this set of sales plays that you can run for high impact. And then the sales plays that you run are just as highly engineered as the propensity model, because you want marketing and sales to be working cohesively across both of those, across those next set of things. So you kind of build this learning loop and feedback loop and test message testing, and continue to drive the outcome that the teams are looking for.
Yeah, that's great. Just to weigh in on the gaps we see on the expansion selling side. A lot of the environments we go into, particularly in technology companies, is there's existing accounts, but they don't really know what to cross sell, upsell. So you get into this view of I'm going to acquire new customers systematically, but then it's like once they're an existing customer, we just don't see a level of maturity in targeting those accounts with real scientific approaches like what you're talking about on the acquisition side. So we even see pipelines that are sometimes not even reflected in the CRM. They might have all of this in an Excel spreadsheet. You might have teams managing hundreds of cross sell, upsell opportunities. It's like, well, how are you tracking and managing this growth pipeline? So we just see it's sort of a nascent area, I would call it a potential huge area for growth. The gap is that it's not up and running yet and it's not really acknowledged, but it's starting to be acknowledged with these pre-intent signals and people starting to recognize that retention, right? Any private equity company wants to hold on to the customers it acquired in the first place. And one of the things we'll talk about is the more relationships and sales you have into those, the longer the retention curve is, obviously, and the portfolio value keeps growing and growing accretively. So That's what
100.
we see. Does that jive with what you sort of
Yeah.
experience?
I think that that bleeding artery that you identified on the expansion side is as bad on the new logo side. So examples of that just from diligence work where you also end up doing the post value, post acquisition work is we will find things like, and this is in over 100 cases. So it's a good N, right? Over 100%. If I look at 100 cases, only 16% of the sales activity when you go back and do the work later is actually in the CRM. So one of the first moves was like, hey, how do we close the gap on the sales activity? And believe it or not, just by moving in um, what's in email and Outlook and some of the other basic tools that the reps are using, you can close the gap really, really quickly, go from 16% to almost 90%. The other, I think, shocking fact there that we found is the a lot of the leads that are buried in emails. I think we found 40% more leads buried in emails that never made it to the CRM because they're buried in systems that are just not designed to easily update the CRM from email. So, and I think it's worse on the expansion side if you know if you look at a very simple way to predict renewal rate is when I first close a new logo, if I have 3 contacts in my database, the number one reason for churn is the champion leaves. Again, if we use some of the novel analytics work from the Vista days, if I triple that in year 1 and I triple that in year 2, so not go 3 to 9, 9 to 27, I mitigate the risk of the champion leaving at that point, which, again, I think that's a really effective in terms of how you can, really get your listeners can get a really quick win on getting churn, a predictable renewal rate.
The gap you just described inside the acquisition pipeline, you can close, as you pointed out, by making sure that the data and the CRM actually has everything in it. I think that there's just a lot of low-hanging fruit that's not even known. And that
Yeah,
brings me to the similarities and differences between go-to-market and go-to-customer. So one side focuses on the seller journey, right? The selling stages. And on the go-to-customer side, we focus on the buyer journey. It's really like the hero's journey, which you're familiar with, but right,
right.
what does the buyer go through? And I thought you and I could compare and contrast these two worlds. Why don't you go first and talk a little bit about the selling stages, when things convert and don't convert? And it's obviously a very intense focus on the sales team itself and what they're doing and what leads to a conversion. And then I'll talk
Right.
about the buyer side and go to customer.
Yeah. Bain and Co has been doing this study, I think, for over 15 years with Google, and they will call it the day one list. What it basically says is when I decide as a buyer that I have a problem, I go out on my own and I do my own research. And 86% of the time, I will find 3 solutions. But the real shocking insight is 92% of the time, I will buy one of those 3 solutions. If I'm not on the original list of 3, my win rate is extremely small. So how do I get on the day 1 list is kind of the big thesis of the work and the playbooks that you design to do that. The pipeline group simply does it by we are in front of and casting a wide net over all the buyers and staying in front of them and doing all the follow up. Um, I think the other thing that's interesting from a go to market perspective is when leads come in. If I look across 60 companies and I just look at closed won opportunities, for someone who bought my software, on average, it took 26 attempts to reach that buyer. Sales reps, if I'm sending leads to them directly, fatigue out typically after 4 tries. And I think the other shocking thing is in that is that are using sequencing tools. They're at 10 and 14 steps, so they don't take the lead far enough to the bone. And then the last thing, and I learned this the hard way, is when I was at a Vista company, they actually cut my budget, my marketing budget, before they knew my name, and it came down to like, if I look at those same 60 companies, 40 to 50% of the time, a lead had no disposition or owner, which means you have a really big black hole there. So you're trying to close all those gaps. But if I could tell your listeners anything, you want to be on the day one list and optimize for that. And I think that's true for an expansion side too.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings me to the expansion side. What we've seen, Kunal, is a lot of traction with what we call pre-intent signals. And intent signals means, to your point, right? You got to be on that day one list to even get in the mix because they're already shopping and the decision's basically done. They're going to pick one of those original three. But there's another level of opportunities, another what I call the invisible pipeline that's upstream from that, and that's these pre-intent signals. We've had a lot of success with identifying a lot of pre-intent signals. So what are those? Those are trigger events when there's an acquisition or a new product launch or a change in leadership or legislation. And part of the go to customer mindset is to get in early, be the first ones in the room to solve that problem. And what are you doing? You're identifying an emerging problem the client may not even realize that they have. You're getting in the room with relevant messaging and aligning capabilities to help address that problem. We see a lot of pipeline opportunities, and those pipeline opportunities are closing when in the hands of a good account team at 3x the average deal size. It is not uncommon for us to see something much greater than that, actually, in terms of the win being in the 40, 50 times size because you're there at a critical moment. So if you're there in the room helping to solve the problem first, you are the list, I guess would be.
Exactly. Dave, I grew up on a horse farm. And one of the things growing up is you see like these working horses, they're draft horses, they're really big and strong, but one horse could pull like 2,000 pounds. And I remember the first time I saw this, when they paired up two horses, I thought it would pull 4,000 pounds, right? That's what my mind was telling me, but it pulled like 10,000 pounds. And that's that benefit that you provide an existing customer, they're going to see that firsthand. Like you get in, but you got to, the reason I did this is like the twin engines of growth to me are like customer obsession and innovation. I believe TPG innovates on the gain access side, but I believe Polaris drives just a great obsession towards the customer and making them successful. That horse story really resonates powerfully, which is why I think you're finding so many big opportunities and big deals.
I think that's so great because the buyer journey is different than the selling stages. The buyer, the hero who has to solve that problem, who has to get that initiative funded, has to build consensus. They've got to have a shared vision. What's interesting is, we talk about these buyer networks being in the 10 to 20 range for these expansion sales. And the reason is because people don't necessarily know how to buy inside their own organization. And so you're really involved heavily in immersing yourself in their world and navigating with them like the guide and moving through the buying stages. And you almost have to lead that consensus building. And then they say, yes, this is urgent. And then I can go ask for funding and back up my request internally with a good story and a roadmap. It's new ground for account teams to navigate, and salespeople in particular on those teams have to lead that.
Yeah, I know in the first 90 days of a deal closing, that is your maximum chance to be introduced to the most number of people because the company wants you to be massively successful. When we're activating a new client, we are cascading really wide, really fast because we want to not only add new contacts, but we want to do it in a way where we're going across the organization. The one thing we both do in common is you have to equip your champion. Like you at least have the champion as when you're expanding and you could equip them and you could even partner with them. When you're selling a new logo, you often don't have that same level of access. So you got to equip the champion in really, really great ways to go in and do exactly what you sell, champion for you effectively internally.
Yeah, that's a great point. And once you land, your expansion opportunity is greatest early on because your sponsors want you to be successful and perceived very positively. I'm always fascinated by what I call leads versus needs. The pipelines look completely different, Kunal. The acquisition team, it was all product-based pipelines. It was literally the name of the products and the selling stages against those products against the target set of accounts. And you're always asking over and over again, is this going to close? Is this going to close? Are we really there? What I've noticed is the expansion pipelines, they're coming from the customer. And so the best teams with the most expansion sales, the pipeline had completely different names. The EBI initiative number 2 project, the integration program, analytic dashboard, whatever, it was not the product name. So I think that there is like right now, if you look at a CRM system, it's mostly the product pipeline, and the expansion pipelines are often not in there. And I like to use the phrase, what's in your pipeline, like the Capital One commercial, to see,
Right.
because you can see it. Do you see that gap yourself?
At a very macro level, like when we diligence a pipeline, we have these few things that we'll look at that we know, like when we do the post-act work, or no, we know them to be true. So, a few examples of that were like if the close date changes more than 3 times, we know there's like an extremely low possibility. I think it's less than 2% that that opportunity ever closes. If there's no next step in the last 30 days or no action in the last 30 days, we know there's less than a 2%. If the next step's not documented, and we could go if it's in the pipeline for over a year, there's a like any one of those I think had a less than a 2% chance of closing, but any two, like they literally never closed, right? So holistically, when you look at pipelines like that, I think you can end up throwing out half the pipeline to begin with because there's just a lot of things that are in there on hope. I think the expansion pipeline, at least what I see is at least they close at a way higher rate than the new logo, but there's a lot to be left. There's a lot of detail that is not in there, as you know, and the way they describe the pipeline is not the way the buyer is actually describing what they're buying or the pipeline. So you have like a mismatch. And I agree with you. The phases and the descriptions for a new logo versus an expansion are very different.
Yeah, I think that you're often making multiple plays at the same client. It's a many to one. And once they trust you as somebody that helps them solve their problems and they believe you have their genuine interests in mind, you can get a very high close rate. So we also saw higher deal sizes. I mean, I've seen in one case, $250,000 was minimum annual revenue on expansion sales. And the acquisition team, I would say, was probably 15.
Right. Yeah. Getting in's hard.
And we got a
Well,
much higher close rate here. So the question is, well, why would I spend my time chasing pot and pan sales at a much lower close rate when I can spend less money pursuing a much higher, close rate over here with bigger deal size?
I agree that I agree that you need new logo to fund those future expand sales. Um, and the land piece might be really small. I think what you'll find fascinating is like if you look at cohort, if I go back to like 2000 and I look at what they buy over time, you will see like when the major expansion occurs might be in year 2 or 3. There's companies we work with where at the end of year 1, it's like a 20x the size of the original deal, right? We do that through what's called cohort analysis. The beauty of tools today that it makes the cohort analysis a lot simpler, but I think you need tools like Polaris to actually decode what's going on in the system because you wake up thinking about expansion every day, and inside of a company, that skill set, the competency varies, I would say, quite a bit. And I think giving them just interesting trigger points inside each of those cohorts helps them tremendously. As an example, like if I'm at TCV, the way we looked at cohorts, like we could see if they bought NetSuite as an example. And we could see that in the technology purchase, and that would be an interesting signal to buy. But you also see revenue go like this. So again, there's probably trigger points that you will find. I'm sure you'll find that you can, in addition to mergers and acquisitions and regulation, that I think would be hugely valuable.
Well, that sort of brings us to set up for the next episode, a way to connect these two worlds. And if you imagine an integrated dashboard where you had the acquisition metrics, but then you had the growth metrics connected in some way. And the synergies between the two, you're acquiring clients that can grow expansively, pursuing those with precision. Then you're activating the right teams in the right way to capture that immediate 90-day opportunity, expand the relationships, cement the retention, and then get to that much higher growth rate. You'd have the one side on the client problems with the expansion cells informing your messaging and even products on the acquisition side, and which combination of capabilities and value were being realized here. But this gap is very real. So the question is, who's filling that gap? These two worlds, they're different but similar. So on one hand you got leads, the other you got needs. They're different, but they mirror each other in a way. And I think that's what we want to explore on the next mini series episode is, what does a unified dashboard that spans this gap potentially look like?
Yeah, I agree, Dave. If you take a look at a wolf pack, the leader sets the pace, but they still need the pack. They can't, the strength is in the pack. And I couldn't agree more that these two things, whether they're hunters or farmers, are more disconnected now than they've ever been. And they do need to come together in one view.
Well, the opportunity for revenue growth is so powerful because you'd be optimizing the productivity on one hand and it dramatically increasing the revenue growth yield on the other. But it would be in a synergistic way where one side's informing the other. But you need to have the data and the insights in a way that leadership can see which levers to pull, and then align their organization to optimize the revenue growth.
100% agree. You have a lot of room for movement in that number, which adds, which adds significant ROI to any purchase in this area that moves that number.
That's great. Well, Kunal, it's been great to explore this with you, this topic, bridging, the divide between the acquisition and expansion pipelines. In our next episode, we'll try to explore what a unified view might look like and which areas we're trying to bring together. Bridging the two worlds will be fun to do.
Looking forward to it, Dave.